Support for WUWM podcast comes from Hop Harvest and Vine and Good Harvest Market in Milwaukee, part of One Destination, combining farm-to-table dining, local craft beers, and organic groceries under one roof. More at goodharvestmarket.com.
Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape our community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
For decades, racially restrictive covenants were a common part of deeds for Milwaukee-area homes. These were clauses that typically restricted properties from being sold to non-white people. Although these covenants have been illegal since the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, their legacy remains in the high segregation we see throughout the Milwaukee area. An ongoing project headed by UW-Milwaukee professors Derek Handley and Ann Bonds is mapping out where these racially restrictive covenants were and where they remain in some property deeds. They join me now to talk about their work. Derek, Ann, thank you both so much for joining us on Lake Effect.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate being here.
Thank you.
How common were these kinds of racially restrictive covenants, especially in the Milwaukee area?
These were used throughout the United States for segregationist purposes. So one estimate is that by 1928, over half of the homes owned by white people had racially restrictive covenants on them. Here in Milwaukee, we see that they were used throughout the city and county itself. And we have found through our research and our work at collaborative mapping with volunteers, we documented 32,506 racial covenants on modern properties in Milwaukee County.
One interesting thing to note about that, between 1920 and 1930, there were 3 times as many covenants as there actually were black people in Milwaukee.
It's interesting just how prolific these covenants were, especially, as you say, at a time when there were very few black Americans who were living in the Milwaukee area. It also seems like while racially restrictive covenants did seem to focus on black Americans, they could also be restrictive of a variety of groups. As you're going through these different racially restrictive covenants, what is the kind of language that you're seeing in them?
Well, we are seeing the language that was common at the time. For instance, in the early 20th century, for those covenants that were restricting African Americans, you'll see no colored person or no Negro. Sometimes we see no one of African descent. A very interesting one is no one of Ethiopian descent. Ethiopian was sometimes used as a stand-in for African Americans. And for those of Asian descent, you might see no Mongolian, things of that sort. But to exclude everyone, you could simply say for the white race only or for Caucasians only.
One of the unique things that we've seen here in Milwaukee is also the inclusion of quote-unquote aliens attached to properties. We see the reference to aliens alongside black people. And of course, this is reference to the fact that Milwaukee is an immigrant city. And in the 1920s, it had a very high proportion of foreign-born residents that made up its population. And so this reference to citizenship or to aliens in the language is certainly referencing that high immigrant population at the time.
As we look at the Milwaukee area, where are most of these racially restrictive covenants kind of clustered? Because that's really the big part of your project, mapping out where we see these different kinds of covenants.
Scholars have always known that these racial covenants existed, but we didn't have a full sense of, how many they were, what their temporality or their time period was, and as you mentioned, their spatial patterning, where they were. And although we do see some examples in Milwaukee, we see that the vast majority of these racial covenants really kind of surround the city of Milwaukee. We see that most of the suburban communities surrounding Milwaukee, within Milwaukee County, have a high proportion of racial covenants. But we see these especially concentrated on the west and the northwest side of the city. So within Wauwatosa, but also land that was unincorporated Wauwatosa, Mariposa, just outside of the city limits of Milwaukee. And as these new homes were being built, that was a growing area, lots of new homes. We see a lot of racial covenants were enacted or included within those neighborhoods. So some neighborhoods, for instance, the northern part of Sherman Park or by Deneen Park, Indorus Park, Hampton Heights, Roosevelt Heights, Sunset Heights. There's many up in that northwest part of town, but then we see them, of course, on the North Shore. And we see them on the south side as well. They're not quite as many on the south side as we see in the north and west side of the city.
Might have been harder to exclude aliens on the south side.
Correct, yes.
As you're looking at these covenants, they were outlawed, of course, and yet they persist after that. Can you unpack that timeline a bit?
Sure. I think they were found to be unenforceable in 1948, Shelley versus Kramer Supreme Court decision. And some of the research I've done surrounding that is some of the real estate folks thought that decision may be overturned. So they were still, even though they were not enforceable, they were still being put into deeds. And it didn't become illegal to have such sort of language until 1968 in the passing of the Fair Housing Act. The bulk of the covenants here in Milwaukee were in the 1920s, which of course they were legal. But even after they were found unenforceable, they would still appear in some of the deeds.
Yeah, they became more frequently used after the year of 1917. And that was a court case that essentially said the Supreme Court ruled that racial zoning could not be utilized by municipal governments. And racial zoning was effectively creating an area or part of a town and saying this is the only place where African Americans can live. And so after the Supreme Court ruled that that was no longer legal, you see racial covenants emerging as a way to kind of circumvent or move around that technique of racial zoning. In fact, sometimes racial covenants were called private zoning as a way for homeowners to enact their own kind of technique of controlling the race of the neighborhood. And so one thing we like to always mention is that these were contested from the very beginning. There were lots of groups that were bringing challenges to them throughout the 1920s and the 1930s up until 1948 with the Supreme Court ruling in Shelley versus Kramer, which made them unenforceable, as Derek mentioned. So these were being legally challenged, but they were being used throughout cities with the intent of maintaining the color line in cities.
This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers, and I'm speaking right now with UW-Milwaukee professors Derek Handley and Ann Bonds about their project mapping Milwaukee's racially restrictive housing covenants. Now, theoretically, we're talking about something that has been outlawed since the 1960s. And I think there are people who would look at this issue and go, yes, this is, an upsetting part of our history, but why revisit it right now? What is the utility in talking about racially restrictive covenants in 2025? Why did you start this project to really map out where these covenants were and how they functioned?
I think that is a very good question. And the approach I take, especially with my students, is I have them ask themselves, why do neighborhoods look the way that they do? Right? And this is not by accident. This is by design. And just to be clear, covenants was just one form of this system. But I think the biggest reason outside of the demographics of neighborhoods, it's a better understanding of the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap. Because if you think about it, how much are people's wealth determined by their property, by their real estate, right? To refinance their home, to improve where they live, or to send their children to college. And so you have this restriction. It didn't matter how hard you work. It didn't matter you were in a two-person household, a traditional family value. If you were a black doctor or a black lawyer or whatever, you couldn't buy in a certain neighborhood. And that was the fact. And you look at it today, the property values across some of these communities, you see a significant difference. So it's having the awareness of how things were to have a better understanding how things are today and what can be done about it, if you will.
Restrictive covenants prevented so many people from access to the most well-resourced parts of a community, the places where there's new construction, where there's schools, where there's green space, and, as Derek mentioned, where property values are high. And so we can think about how these really worked to confine people to certain parts of the city. And yes, they are no longer legal. They're still embedded in our deeds, however, as a way for us to kind of look at the architecture of the ways in which our communities and our neighborhoods were produced over time.
Over the past few years, communities throughout Wisconsin have been disavowing these restrictive covenants, specifically since it seems about 2022. What's the purpose of that? What does that look like?
Well, I think in each community it might be a little bit different. But number one, just to acknowledge that they're there and to disavow of them. I think some communities may put a mechanism where they can have them removed. But of course, that would require money to do so. But we've been happy since the project has come about to see that action. I think Wauwatosa, Glendale, Greenfield, Whitefish Bay, the county itself, as well as state legislation. So folks have been acknowledging it and repudiating these covenants.
I think that when people learn about these as existing, maybe within their own property records, it's jarring and upsetting, and people don't want to be associated or have that kind of language embedded in the records, even if they are no longer enforceable. And so I think just having the opportunity to recognize the existence of these and to account for them and to acknowledge them and then to renounce them, it's largely symbolic, but it's very important in terms of kind of taking account for the past and seeking to move forward from those histories of racism and exclusion. There has been state legislation where people can actually go through a process to have these discharged from their property records. So I think that that's been taking place a lot in Dane County.
Well, and as part of your mapping project, you can look at where these racially restrictive covenants were and maybe find your own property among them.
Mm-hmm. That is correct. So the map is available on our website where you can see where you live and if your house or property has a racial covenant. But the other thing I want to add, and I think is important, ever since these have been put into place in the 20th century, members of the Black community had known that there were certain places they could not go, and those legacies in some way still continue, even though some of these things may not be legal. Something as simple when you're looking to buy a house, what neighborhood the real estate agent will show you. We've heard some of these stories that there were certain neighborhoods that wouldn't get shown to them. So even though the covenants are not legal, the legacies and these histories, they show up in other ways in regards to housing in Milwaukee.
Yeah. As I believe you mentioned, this is an ongoing project. This is not the end of the project by any means. What are your goals for the future of it?
Well, we are so pleased to have reached this milestone, and it has been an enormous effort with so many community volunteers. And so I do want to take this opportunity to thank them because we did have such a large number of these racial covenants. It would not have been possible for Derek or I or our team to identify them all ourselves. So we couldn't have done this without so many members of the community who invested their time and volunteered with the project. But the other thing that we're wanting to really document through this process is also how these covenants were being challenged and resisted by members of the community in Milwaukee, and especially by Black Milwaukeeans. As Derek mentioned, these were well documented. We know that the NAACP was tracking them. We also know that the Milwaukee Urban League was looking to challenge or seek opportunities to get it better housing for Black Milwaukeeans. And so we're trying to also tell that equally vital part of the story, that we really can't understand the history of racial covenants in Milwaukee County without also understanding how people were seeking to circumvent them and to challenge them and finding ways around them, quite frankly. And those stories are also part of our history that are so significant to document.
And we want to be able to share these things. We're currently raising funds to be able to develop an interactive website where folks can access this information. In ideal world, we would like this data to be available for scholars who are doing research. Ann and I are just two people. There's so many questions you can ask of this data, community groups or government officials. We want to have a website that's easily accessible to make this available for everyone. So that's why we say that the project continues. We're collecting stories. Those are things that we want to capture as well.
Well, Derek, Ann, thank you both so much for joining us here on Lake Effect and sharing your work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Derek Handley and Ann Bonds are professors at UW-Milwaukee, and they lead its project mapping racially restrictive housing covenants in the Milwaukee area. You can explore the map online at sites.uwm.edu/mapping-racism-resistance.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting wuwm.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.
Sources and methods, the crown jewels of the intelligence community. Shorthand for how do we know what's real? Who told us? If you have those answers, you're on the inside, and NPR wants to bring you there. From the Pentagon to the State Department to spy agencies, listen to understand what's really happening and what it means for you. Sources and Methods, the new national security podcast from NPR.